So many wives who are carrying their marriage alone are often really open to having the tough conversations and more than willing to work on the relationship. But the harder they work, the more distant their husbands seem to become. If that's you, you're probably exhausted from feeling like you're the only one who's trying in your relationship. Frustrated that if it weren't for you, the marriage might already be over. And heartbroken that you seem to be the only one who really cares. But what if the very things that you've been doing to try to fix your marriage are actually keeping it stuck? Today, I'm going to explain why you're stuck in this dynamic and what you can do differently that actually invites your husband back into the relationship. I'm Laura Amador, relationship coach for wives, and I help women to restore connection, peace, and intimacy in their marriages. And if you're a wife who desperately wants a more connected and happier marriage, then this episode's for you. When I was a newlywed, one of my coworkers, who also happened to be an experienced marital veteran, warned me and said, "My marriage was great until I tried to fix it, that is." At the time, I was perplexed, but heeded her warning that at the time was, don't try to fix what isn't broken. But what about fixing what was broken? When a marriage starts feeling disconnected, it's often the wife who's the first responder. Often she feels like the only one who's really noticing, the first one who's starting to worry about it, and who wants to talk about it and, of course, fix it. And if you're anything like me and most of the wives that I speak to, you're a doer, you're a go getter, and you don't like to just sit around with your arms crossed while things collapse around you. You roll up your sleeves, start doing the research, and set out to fix the problem. You're willing to open up and have the vulnerable conversations. You research and start reading books. You might even suggest counseling. Anything to restore the connection and come back to a place where you both feel happy. But then something happens. The more that you focus on the problems within the relationship, the more your husband seems to pull away. And now you're even more hurt and frustrated. Because from your perspective, you're trying to improve the marriage because you care. And from his perspective, he often feels like he's constantly being told that something's wrong. And that something is him. He often feels like he's being told that he's the problem. And this is where so many couples get stuck. The wife becomes more hurt and resentful the more that she feels like she's carrying the marriage alone, and the husband feels more discouraged and criticized. So you push harder, and your husband withdraws further. You interpret that as him not caring, but your husband often experiences it as never being able to get it right. And before either of you realize it, you're trapped in this painful cycle that neither of you ever wanted. And that's why this is so important. Because if you feel like you're carrying the marriage alone, the answer lies in understanding the cycle that you've gotten stuck in so that you can reroute and create a new cycle, one that actually makes you both feel happy and emotionally safe. And that's what we're covering today. One of the biggest shifts I help wives make is realizing that they accidentally become the marriage manager. Not because they wanted to carry the weight of the relationship on their shoulders alone, of course not, but they often unwittingly signed up for this role. Yes, because of love and care, and also because it's often in their nature to try to fix what's not working. But underneath all of that is a deeper truth. It's also because they were afraid. A wife notices the distance and thinks, I need to do something. So she starts tracking the health of the relationship and monitoring how connected things feel, watching for signs of distance, becoming hyper aware of the relationship and looking for signs that he's disengaged or not meeting her expectations. She's trying to figure out where the gaps are and what's going wrong. And pretty soon, without even realizing it, she's taken over the responsibility not only for her relationship with the marriage, but for his relationship with the marriage as well. So maybe this sounds familiar. Let's say that you hear a marriage podcast or read a book or see a reel and immediately think, oh, I need him to hear this. So you send it to him. And then later you're wondering, did he listen? Did he read it? And then maybe the next day, what did he think? Should I ask him about it? And before long, you're not just responsible for your own growth, but you're trying to manage his growth too. And that's exhausting. That's a lot for one person to carry. And that's where things start feeling really heavy. I remember a wife telling me, Laura, I feel like I care more about our marriage than my husband does. And honestly, the way that she was describing her life, it very much looked that way. She thought about the marriage every day, and it seemed like he didn't. She was reading the books and researching solutions. He wasn't. She was working on herself and going to therapy. He wasn't. She was initiating conversations and checking in on how he felt. He wasn't doing that for her. But then I asked her a question. I said, "Who appointed you manager of your husband's relationship with the marriage?" And she laughed and then got quiet because she realized that she'd spent years trying to manage whether he cared, whether he was growing, whether he was motivated, and whether he was changing. And those were all things that she actually couldn't control at all. Because here's the thing: yes, you can influence your husband, you can inspire him, you can invite him, and you can create emotional safety with him, but you cannot control him. That's the truth of life. We cannot control anybody else except for ourselves. And the problem with all the different ways that most wives go about trying to fix their marriage is that they're often heavily seated in control. Though you might not see it that way, and of course, that's not your intention, that's how most husbands feel it. For example, let's read this marriage book together. To you, I'm sure that what you mean by that and the underlying message is, I love you, let's figure this out together. But often what he hears is, you're not being a good husband. So read this book that's going to teach you how to be better. Or if you say, let's go to counseling, it might be your way of saying, I really care about our marriage and I want it to be great for both of us. But what he often hears is, you're failing at being a husband and I found someone that's going to set you straight. You might say, can we talk about us? And what you probably mean is, I want to share my heart with you and understand your perspective too. But what he hears is, I'm going to tell you everything you're doing wrong and how unhappy you make me. And that's enough to make any person withdraw. He might show up physically, but his walls go up to protect himself from what he fears is a launch of attack. The love and care that you're trying to convey isn't making it over the walls and landing in the way that you hoped. Then your walls go up because you're tired of feeling hurt. And so you see, the way that many wives try to fix the problems in their marriage is all too often perpetuating the very problems with more walls and less connection. And I know that that could be really hard to hear because you might think, well, then what am I supposed to do? But once you see this, it's incredibly freeing because it means that your job isn't to carry the marriage. You can set a new tone between you, and that means letting go of needing him to change before things can get better. So here's a question: what part of your husband's relationship with the marriage have you been trying to manage for him? Once you become the marriage manager, your brain starts looking for proof that you are indeed carrying it alone. The human brain is a brilliant lawyer. One wife told me about how her husband walks through the door after work and he doesn't even ask her about her day anymore. He heads straight to the garage, shuts the door, and she feels shut out and, of course, hurt. And her brain immediately would say to her, see, he doesn't care. He's checked out. But what she didn't know at the time was that earlier that afternoon, her husband had called the mechanic because her car was making a strange noise. He had picked up the medication that she'd mentioned needing, and he works through lunch so that he could make it home in time for dinner. None of those things excuse the lack of emotional connection, but they do tell a different story than he doesn't care. There's often so much more to the picture that we can miss when we're really zoomed into what's not happening or what's not meeting our expectations. Once your brain decides that something's true, it starts gathering evidence to prove that case. And when you've been hurt in your marriage, your brain often starts building a case that says, he doesn't care. And suddenly everything becomes evidence for that. He forgot to ask about your day, evidence. He seemed distracted during a conversation, more evidence. He didn't respond the way you hoped he would when you wanted to talk about the relationship, even more evidence. And before long, your brain has built a very convincing argument that you're alone in this. But here's the problem with that. When we're collecting evidence for one side of the case, we often stop noticing evidence that doesn't fit the case. Perhaps you mentioned that your mom hasn't been doing well and he sent her flowers, or he worked late to provide for the family. He handled a problem without being asked, or he sat beside you when you were struggling. It's easy to miss these moments when you're feeling alone and disappointed. Now, I'm not saying that your emotional needs don't matter because they absolutely do matter. And I'm not saying that you should settle for less connection than what you want. What I am saying is that resentment often narrows our perspective. And when our perspective narrows, we stop seeing the whole picture. One question I love asking wives is, if your husband sat in my chair right now and told me how he shows love, what do you think he'd say? It's amazing the kinds of things that wives respond to that. Because suddenly we're no longer looking at only at what's missing, we're seeing what's present too. And that's often where softening begins. Now, the next piece might be the most important thing I shared today. Many wives believe the only way for things to ever improve is if I try harder and he finally changes. And it makes sense because in other areas of our life, it is true that the harder that we try and the harder that we work, the more successful we become, right? If you work harder, you'll get better results. If you practice more, you'll improve faster. But relationships don't always work that way. In fact, sometimes more effort creates more distance. Have you ever noticed that the more conversations you try to initiate, the less likely he is to initiate one? Or the more reminders that you give, the less likely he is to take initiative on his own? The more you monitor the relationship, the less likely he is to think about it. The more responsibility you take on, the less responsibility he seems to carry. Most wives never connect those dots. I remember a wife who told me, I hate that I have to plan every date night. I even have to remind him about our anniversary every year because if I didn't, I'm sure that he'd forget. And when I asked her how she felt about that, she said, resentful. She wanted him to initiate. She wanted him to pursue her. And she wanted him to think about her and seek connection with her. But she felt so sure in her bones that if she didn't plan any date nights, they would never have one ever again. And then one day she realized, I've been so busy making sure that we have date nights that I've never actually given him the opportunity to prove otherwise. And that realization gave her the courage to try something different. So when she finally stopped planning date nights and reminding him of everything, she was shocked when he stepped up, made the reservation, and confirmed the babysitter. So many wives are looking at their effort and thinking, I'm helping. And they are helping. But they may also be unintentionally occupying all the space where his initiative could be developing. And underneath that help is often the deeper message that there's a lack of trust in him, a lack of trust that he's capable, and a lack of belief that he cares. And again, that makes sense because I'm sure you have all the evidence to prove it. Just like if you zoom out and see the things that are happening, there may be a bigger picture at play. Think about a manager and an employee. The manager tracks everything, right? Follows up, monitors progress, sets the agenda. And the employee is constantly responding and often dislikes and even resents the manager because, let's be real, most people don't enjoy being micromanaged. Many marriages accidentally fall into this dynamic, and then the wife feels resentful and exhausted because she's carrying everything alone. And meanwhile, her husband feels discouraged because he feels like whatever he does do is never enough and she's never happy with him. One of the most powerful things a wife can learn is how to invite her husband back into the relationship, not through her own withdrawal, but by choosing to give him the benefit of the doubt, choosing to trust him even when it feels like things might not go perfectly if you let go, and giving him space to be fully himself, make his own choices, think for himself without help or reminders, and really give him the space to initiate, to contribute, and to show up to the relationship. Because you can't create partnership by carrying both sides. And sometimes the first step toward partnership is putting something down. In this case, putting down the very need to fix him. Needing to control the outcome and invitation are two very different things. Somewhere along the way, many wives started believing if he cared more, he would do more. And so understandable. And that often leads to becoming hyper vigilant, constantly taking the temperature of the relationship, trying to find solutions and fix what isn't working, and getting hurt and exhausted when nothing seems to get better. They end up carrying so much emotionally and becoming resentful and hopeless along the way. But positively influencing your relationship doesn't come from carrying more or trying harder, because healthy marriages aren't built because one person becomes strong enough to carry everything. They're built when both people are allowed to carry what belongs to them, which means wives releasing their husband's paper and everything on it back to him, drastically lightening her own load so she finally has space and energy to tend to her own joy again. Real intimacy isn't created through problem hacking, but through trust, which requires releasing the need to control the outcome, and it requires choosing faith over fear. It's release of the belief that if you lighten your grip, your world will come crashing down around you. You deserve to feel emotionally safe and to know that your greatest power lies in your influence and invitations, and not in the constant putting out of all the little fires that seem to pop up all around you. You were never meant to be running around your marriage, carrying heavy buckets of water with your blistered and exhausted hands, putting out fires alone. You deserve to feel secure, cherished, supported, and appreciated. And when you stop carrying what isn't yours, you often discover just how much strength, peace, and influence you actually have, and the power you have to set a new tone and energy between you and your husband. But the first step is putting the buckets down that were never yours to carry. What burns inevitably becomes fertilizer, creating a nutrient rich soil primed for regrowth of something beautiful. Just like a phoenix rising from the ashes, a marriage can be reborn where things once seemed hopeless. I want to invite you to ask yourself where in your marriage you've been running around putting fires out, and to experiment with setting the heavy buckets of water down, of running your tired, blistered soul under cool running water and lovingly covering yourself with a gentle balm. In other words, using the energy that you've been using on trying to hold everything together on your own and using it instead to tend to yourself, to giving yourself nourishment, starting with the basics of proper sleep, hydrating, and good food, then moving on to things that delight you and bring you joy, like creativity, reading, seeing friends, visiting museums, rocking out to your favorite playlists, moving your body, whatever it is for you, really prioritizing that. What if the future of your marriage depended on you making yourself happy? If what you want is a better and healthier, more joyful marriage, this is the first and non negotiable stepping stone. It's a powerful place to start, and you absolutely are deserving of it. Now, if you want to go deeper with this, I have a free guide called 3 Steps to Reignite Connection that will give you the actionable and practical steps that you can take. And you can download that in the description. And if you're listening to this and thinking, Laura, I've been working so hard to fix my marriage and I still feel stuck, you don't have to do this alone. When you're inside the dynamic, it can be really difficult to see it clearly. That's where coaching can make all the difference. I help wives stop the cycle of resentment and disconnection and become the woman who creates emotional safety, intimacy, and influence in her marriage. If you're ready for more personalized support, you'll find information about working with me one on one in the description as well. You don't have to keep carrying this burden all by yourself. There's another way, and I'd be honored to help you find it. Thank you so much for tuning in, and until next time, keep softening into love.